If he touches that folder
Rourke, the
again,
audit trap is set.
the badge printer
No
downstairs
escaping.
will start spitting out his arrest paperwork. I didn't say it loud. I didn't have to. The air in the office was already so thin, so recycled and cold, that a whisper cut through it like a paper slice. Commander Blake Rourke froze, his hand hovering 3 inches above the beige manila cardstock. It was a standard issue folder,
No turning back now.
the kind you could buy in bulk from Government Services Administration Supply, frayed slightly at the corners, smelling of toner and dry heat. But on that mahogany desk, under the humming fluorescent strips of the admin block, it had the gravitational pull of a landmine. Rourke looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time since I'd transferred here 8 months ago. Until this morning, I was just Mercer from Audit, furniture, background noise, the woman who checked the logs and approved the requisition forms for printer toner. Now, I was the anomaly. He blinked, a slow, lizard-like movement, his eyes shifting from the folder to my face, looking for the bluff. He wouldn't find one. My hands were folded on my lap, resting against the cheap fabric of my skirt. I could feel the weight of the pager clipped to my belt. It was an old Motorola, a black brick of plastic that hadn't made a sound in 4 hours. Its silence was heavy, heavier than the folder. You're confused. Mercer, Rourke said. His voice was a low rumble, designed to vibrate through bulkheads and make junior enlisted sailors straighten their spines. It didn't work on me. I watched a bead of condensation slide down the side of his iced coffee mug, leaving a clear trail through the condensation. This isn't a negotiation. That file contains operational data, classified data. It stays in this office. He didn't understand. They never did. Not until the access badge reader turned red. He thought power was the brass on his collar, the ability to shout orders into a radio and have jets scramble on the flight line. He didn't realize that power was paperwork. Real power was the timestamp on a log entry, the digital footprint of an approval granted 3 seconds after a warning flag was suppressed. Real power was the sequence. I had built the audit trap weeks ago, burying it deep in the procurement subroutines, waiting for exactly this moment. It's not operational data anymore. Commander, I said. My voice felt flat, detached, like I was reading a serial number off a shipping container. That was the craving, the itch under my skin that never went away until the columns balanced, the need for the system to be clean, its chain of custody evidence. Once you pulled it from the archive without a countersign, you flagged it. If you open it, you alter the integrity. If you alter the integrity, the system triggers, Rourke scoffed. A short, sharp exhale through his nose. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking, trying to reclaim the physical space of the room. Outside the window, the flight line was a blur of heat, haze, and distant motion, the dull roar of engines bleeding through the double-paned glass. But inside, it was just the hum of the server rack in the corner and the ticking of the clock on the wall. He was calculating. I could see the gears turning, optics, leverage, who he could call to have me removed. He was used to social friction, to the hierarchy theater where a glare meant obey. He wasn't used to math. You think a printer scares me, he laughed. But it didn't reach his eyes. I run this support squadron. I have 3 birds in the air right now dealing with a link stability issue. And you're in here threatening me with, what? Administrative hassle. He moved then. It wasn't a retreat, it was a test. He stood up, his shadow falling across the desk, eclipsing the folder. He reached out again, his fingers splayed. Deliberate. He was going to call the bluff. He was going to open it, prove that he was the commander and I was just the help. My breath held. Not from fear. Fear is useful. Fear keeps you sharp. But from the sheer, grinding compulsion of seeing a pattern complete itself. I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't reach for the phone. I just sat there, feeling the dead man switch logic of the situation. The access and privilege mismatch on his account was already logged. The system was waiting for the final input. Physical contact. His fingertips brushed the edge of the manila tab. The sound was dry, a whisper of skin on paper. I didn't blink. I focused on the pager on my hip. It remained silent. That was the terrible thing about it. If it pinged, it meant someone else had intervened. Someone else had started the escalation. If it stayed silent, it meant I was the only one left. It meant the trap was live, and I was the trigger. Rourke stopped. Maybe he saw something in my face, not defiance, but the absolute, bored certainty of a woman who knows exactly how the machine works because she wrote the manual. Maybe he realized that the silence wasn't submission. Or maybe, just maybe, he heard the phantom sound of a badge printer 3 floors down, warming up its rollers, ready to spit out a sheet of paper that would end a 20-year career in less than 10 seconds. He withdrew his hand. Slowly, he picked up his coffee mug instead. The condensation, making his grip slippery. He took a drink, his eyes never leaving mine, the folder sitting between us like an unexploded bomb. "Leave it," he said, the command sounding hollow. "Get out. We'll discuss your performance review later." I stood up. My knees didn't shake. I adjusted my blazer, feeling the cool air hit my back. I didn't look at the folder again. I didn't need to. The trap was set. The pager was still silent. A heavy, black weight against my side, waiting for the inevitable degrade that I knew was coming. I turned and walked to the door, the sound of my heels loud on the tile, counting the steps away from the blast zone. I hadn't won. I had just bought time, and in this building, time was the most expensive commodity of all. The walk back to my cubicle took exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I counted the steps, using the rhythm to slow my heart rate. Adrenaline is a chemical signaling error in my line of work. It makes hands shake and eyes miss details. By the time I passed the break room, where a junior lieutenant was arguing with the vending machine, I was just Mercer again. The invisible woman. The background texture of the logistics department. Nobody looked at me. Nobody saw the woman who had just threatened a base commander with career suicide. They just saw a GS-9 clearing a path, holding a folder against her chest like a shield. My workspace was in the cage. A windowless bullpen shared with IT support and the overflow from scheduling. It smelled of stale carpet and ozone. Noah Bennett was at the desk opposite mine, headset around his neck, spinning a pen. He didn't look up. To him, I was a function, and not a person. I sat down. We placed the folder in the lower drawer and locked it. K in, turn, key out, pocket. It was a muscle memory, a competence tell that happened without conscious thought. I woke my terminal. Before the screen even flickered, my fingers were already typing the complex string of the session auth key. I didn't look at the keys. You don't look at the keys if you want the password to stay yours. The system hummed to life, a wall of gray text on a black background. Most people see boredom in these logs. I see architecture. I pulled up the daily access roster and overlaid it with the physical gate logs. Bennett sighed loudly, tossing his pen onto a stack of requisition forms. They want me to re-image 3 terminals in ops because someone spilled a latte, he said to the ceiling. Priority 1 ticket? Apparently, caffeine is a national security threat. It's not the caffeine, I said, my eyes scanning the timestamps, looking for the drift. It's the sugar. Sticky keys compromise input speed. It's a tragedy, Merced. That's what it is. Bennett picked up the pen again. We spend $40 billion on stealth technology, but we can't design a cup lid that doesn't leak when a fresh ensign gets nervous. And it was the truth of the base. We tracked every round of ammunition and every gallon of jet fuel with obsessive precision, but the administrative friction, the leaking lids, the lost forms, the ego-driven ticket escalations, was the real enemy. It was a chaotic organism trying to pass itself off as a machine. I ignored Bennett's performance of suffering and typed in a query command. I needed to verify the integrity of the folder I'd just leveraged. I checked the checksums. Green. Then I checked the view logs. That's when the pattern snagged. It was small, a jagged edge in a smooth stream of data. A user account, sysadmin04, had flagged a login at the server farm's physical terminal at 0400 hours. Standard maintenance window. Nothing illegal. Except I knew the roster. I knew sysadmin04 was a contractor named Hemlock, and I knew Hemlock had been approved for sick leave starting yesterday. I didn't gasp. I didn't lean in. I sat perfectly still. The compulsion kicked in, the itch behind my eyes that demanded the column's balance. I brought up the gate logs for the physical server room. No badge scan for Hemlock. There it was. An access and privilege mismatch. The system said he was there digitally. The door said he wasn't there physically. Someone had used valid credentials from a location that shouldn't have been possible without a physical bypass. It wasn't a glitch. Glitches are random. This was specific. This was clean. You okay, Merced? I looked up. Chief Eli Navarro was standing at the edge of my cubicle, holding a clipboard. He was Old Navy, the kind of chief who wore his uniform like a second skin. He had seen me staring at the screen for 30 seconds without blinking. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at my hands, resting perfectly still on the desk edge. He knew the difference between a freeze response and focus. Fine, Chief, I said. My voice was level. Public mask, firmly in place. Just reconciling the printer usage stats. Navarro didn't buy it. He glanced at the screen, then back to me. He didn't know what I was looking at, but he recognized the posture. It was the same way a mechanic looks at an engine that sounds right, but vibrates wrong. Don't work too hard, Navarro said, his tone dry. The commander's in a mood. Might roll downhill. I know, I said. He lingered for a fraction of a second, evaluating, then nodded and walked away. He had seen the competence, even if he didn't have a name for it yet. I looked back at the screen. The mismatch blinked at me, a silent error code in a sea of green. I didn't report it. Not yet. Reporting a glitch gets you a ticket number. Reporting a pattern gets you a target on your back. I initiated a background trace, tagging the entry for a localized hold. I wasn't going to fix it. I was going to watch it. The audit trap wasn't just the folder in my drawer anymore. It was the whole network. And someone had just stepped on the trigger plate. The radio chatter started as a low burr in the corner of the office, the kind of white noise you learn to ignore until the rhythm breaks. Then the tone shifted. It wasn't a shout. Professional panic is always quiet. It was the clipped, sterile urgency of a controller realizing he was about to lose a bird. Signal loss on feed 2. Reacquiring. Negative on handshake. I stopped typing. My hands hovered over the keyboard. the cursor blinking on the procurement log I'd been freezing. I looked at the clock on the wall. 9:14. The exact time the morning patrol block was supposed to be handing off coverage. Bennett pulled his headset off, his face pale. "You hearing that, Mercer? That's not a weather glitch." "Oh, I hear it," I said. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, the motion purely mechanical. The air in the room suddenly felt thinner, charged with the invisible static of a system failure. The UAV and ISR link degrade wasn't just a technical problem. It was an operational blindfold dropping over the fleet. If the eyes went dark, the decisions went blind, and blind decisions got people killed. I walked to the window. The flight line was a blur of heat shimmer, the tarmac baking under the sun. Out there, ground crews were already scrambling, yellow vests, moving like frantic wasps. A red light was flashing on the control tower. "They're calling for an immediate clear," Bennett said, tapping his screen. "Report of FOD on the main runway. Same time as the link drop." That's bad timing." "It's not timing," I said. "It's clutter." And I didn't explain. I didn't have to. I walked out of the bullpen and into the corridor, moving against the flow of junior officers rushing toward the ops center. They were running on adrenaline. I was moving on pattern recognition. The degrade wasn't random. Link stability doesn't just evaporate without a precursor spike in the error logs. And FOD doesn't just appear on a secure runway unless someone left it there or the sensors were told to see it. I reached the heavy steel door of the server node, the one place where the digital ghost of the base intersected with the physical reality. I swiped my badge. The beep was sharp, judgmental. Inside, the hum was deafening. Rows of server racks blinked in the dark, a cathedral of data. I wasn't authorized to touch the operational controls, but I was authorized to audit the power draw. I found a terminal in the corner, logging in with the same sequence I'd used 1,000 times. The screen flared to life. I wasn't looking for the link status. I was looking for the shadow. "Mercer, what the hell are you doing in here?" It was Lieutenant Pike, the ops duty officer. He stood in the doorway, breathless, his uniform disheveled. He looked like a man trying to hold back a flood with a spoon. "We have a critical failure. Get out. This is a restricted zone during an active incident. I'm not touching your birds." "Lieutenant," I said, not turning around. My eyes were locked on the scrolling text. "I'm checking the load balance. If you reboot the main array, while the auxiliary power is fluctuating, you'll fry the encryption keys. Then you won't just be blind. You'll be deaf too." Pike stopped. He knew I was right. He hated that I was right. "Just don't touch anything else," he snapped, then vanished back into the chaos. I watched the lines of code race by. I isolated the timestamp for the link degrade. 9:14 and 3 seconds. Then I overlaid the user access log for the same second. There it was. A single, silent entry from a terminal that shouldn't have been active. Maintenance, admin 02. The account belonged to a technician who had transferred out 3 weeks ago. The craving hit me then. The need to fix it, to flag it, to scream that the system was being gamed. But I didn't. I let the compulsion settle into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. The degrade wasn't an accident. It was a screen. Someone needed the eyes of the base to blink, just for a few minutes. And they had used a ghost to pull the switch. I printed the log. 1 page. The sound of the printer in the empty room was loud, aggressive. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, right next to the silent pager. The audit trap was widening. It wasn't just money anymore. It was operational control. I walked out of the server room, back into the panic of the hallway. The red light was still flashing. The base was blind, but I had just found the light switch, and the hand on it wasn't human error. It was deliberate. The briefing room smelled of burned coffee and aggressive floor wax, a chemical cocktail that always tasted like bureaucracy. It was a windowless box on the second floor of the command building, designed for the slow death of urgency under the weight of PowerPoint slides. The tower's pulsing red crisis light was gone, replaced here by the dusty, flickering cone of the projector cutting through stagnant air. The steady hum of the air conditioning had erased the panic of the radio chatter. The crisis had been processed, chewed up by the machine, and spat out as a stack of collated forms sitting in the center of the mahogany table. I sat at the far end, away from the power players, hands resting still on my closed notebook. I watched dust motes dance in the beam, swirling in patterns that made more sense than the agenda. The chairs, upholstered in scratchy blue fabric, unchanged since the Cold War, held the heat of the bodies sitting in them. Everyone sweated slightly, not from fear, but from the low-grade fever of impatience. They wanted the box checked so they could return to the comfortable fiction of a secure base. Lieutenant Pike stood at the head of the table, looking clean, rested, and dangerously reasonable. He clicked through a slide deck titled, Incident Review, Network Latency Event 0900. His laser pointer trembling slightly. His voice was calm, rehearsed. The voice of a man reading a script he desperately wanted to believe. Preliminary assessment indicates a localized router sync error in Sector 4, Pike said, the laser dot circling a diagram of green lines. The link degrade wasn't a failure of the bird or the satellite. It was a traffic collision. A scheduled maintenance patch for the legacy logistics database collided with an unscheduled high-traffic window from the meteorological download. He paused, letting the jargon settle like a warm blanket. The system prioritized packet integrity over the real-time stream to prevent corruption. It throttled the video feed to save the logs. It's a known legacy issue with the older Cisco routers. We've seen it in simulation logs twice this year. He made deliberate eye contact with everyone except me. The squadron commander, jaw set in fatigue, checked his watch, calculating the paperwork saved. The safety officer, a contractor with coffee stains on his tie, made a dutiful note, his pen loud in the silence. It was a perfect, seamless explanation. It accounted for lost minutes without blaming a person. It explained the blindness without admitting vulnerability. It even covered the FOD report. Sensor ghosting due to signal latency, Pike called it. It was clean. It was logical. It was safe. And it was a lie. I didn't speak. I felt the table vibrate as someone tapped their foot. I picked up my pen, feeling the cool metal, and wrote maintenance patch in my notebook. I pressed hard enough to indent the paper, carving the lie into the page. We verified server logs with the off-site contractor, Pike continued, confidence growing. He clicked to a screenshot of a time-stamped log, highlighted in yellow. They confirmed a remote update push at 9:14 exactly. It aligns perfectly with the outage window. The contractor accepted responsibility for the scheduling conflict. They'll issue a patch for the patch by Monday. Chief Navarro sat across from me, arms crossed. He wasn't taking notes. He watched Pike with half-lidded eyes, unreadable as a statue. Navarro knew the routers were air-gapped from logistics. He knew they didn't take remote updates during ops hours without a key turn. But he also knew the room. Truth right now was an inconvenience that would keep everyone until midnight, triggering a safety stand-down. A lie that let them go home was currency, and the inflation rate was skyrocketing. The urge to speak rose in my throat like heartburn. The compulsion to slide the printout from my pocket across the table. 9:13:57. 3 seconds before the update. A ghost login from a dead account. The math didn't work. The sequence was wrong. Pike's timestamps were too clean, too synchronized. Wea Lostdrift. These were manicured. My chest ached, ribs tightening. The audit trap I had set was twitching, sensing the cover-up. But I looked at the clock above Pike's head. 10:45. The golden hour of incident reporting had closed. If I spoke now, I wouldn't be a whistleblower protecting the mission. I would be a disruption. The hysterical admin blocking the all-clear. I would be the problem they solved next. Pike finally looked at me. He couldn't avoid it forever. He needed unanimity. Merced, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge wrapped in procedural courtesy. The room contracted, air pressure dropping. Does logistics have any outstanding flags on the hardware inventory? Or can we close this ticket? The room went absolute quiet. The air conditioning hummed, filling the space. They were all looking at me now. Commandant, safety officer, Pike, waiting for the anomaly, ready to crush it. I looked at Pike. I looked at the lie on the screen. Then I looked at my notebook. I closed it. The sound was soft. Final? No outstanding flags on the hardware. Lieutenant, I said. My voice was level, stripped of accusation, flat as a deal tone. The inventory matches the authorized list. I didn't say the software matched. I didn't say the logs matched. I answered the specific, narrow question he asked, leaving the silence to carry the weight of what I didn't say. Pike blinked, surprised by the lack of resistance, and exhaled a puff of relief. He took it as surrender. He didn't see it as a deposit. I was storing the lie, letting them file it, sign it, stamp it. Because a documented lie is more valuable than a shouted truth. Once signed, they owned it. Good, the commander said, standing abruptly. Let's get this filed. Flight line back to full status by 1100. Dismissed. Chairs scraped against linoleum, the sound jarring. Tension broke, dissolving into shuffling papers and relieved conversation. I stood up slowly, feeling older than an hour ago. Navarro caught my eye as he gathered his cap. He didn't nod or smile. He just looked at my closed notebook, then my face. He knew I hadn't let it go. He knew I was waiting for the interest to compound. I walked out, leaving the incident closed report on the table like a paper tombstone. The hallway was bright, empty. I checked my pager, still silent. The black plastic was warm against my hip. The clock was ticking, invisible and relentless. They thought they had bought a solution. They had only bought a delay, and the price was going up by the second. The transition from the air-conditioned hallway to the flight line exterior wasn't just a change in temperature. It was a physical assault. I pushed open the heavy steel fire door and the world instantly dissolved into vibration. The noise didn't come from a specific direction. It was atmospheric, a solid wall of pressure generated by the twin afterburners of a bird testing its engines on the tarmac 300 yards away. It hit me in the chest first, a resonant thrum that rattled my teeth and made the bones of my inner ear ache. The air tasted of unburnt kerosene and ozone, the sharp, metallic flavor of thrust. I stood in the shadow of the blast deflector wall, a massive slab of concrete scorched black by decades of exhaust. This was the unofficial smoking pit, the blast zone, where the hierarchy came to strip off its veneer for 5 minutes at a time. The ground here didn't just shake, it convulsed. Every time the jet throttled up, the chain link fence separating us from the runway screamed, the metal links grinding against each other in a high-pitched chorus that cut through the low-frequency roar. Dust danced on the concrete, vibrating in geometric patterns that mirrored the invisible sonic waves pummeling us. You couldn't stand straight here. You had to lean into the noise, brace your shoulder against the concrete, and shout to be heard. It was a place where physical discomfort was the price of admission, and, right now, the admission fee was being paid by the men who had just lied to the base. They were gathered in a loose circle near the ash can. Rourke, Pike, and a civilian contractor named Sutter who wore a lanyard that cost more than my car. They weren't cowering from the noise. They were leaning into it, shouting, their mouths open and wide, aggressive laughter that looked like screaming until you saw their eyes. Pike was holding court, gesturing wildly with a lit cigarette. "So I told him," Pike shouted, his voice cracking over the roar of the engine test. "I said, Sir, we didn't lose the data. We just put it in a secure location where nobody can find it. And he bought it. He actually signed the ticket." The group exploded into laughter. It wasn't joyful. It was the sharp, barking sound of men who had just walked along a cliff edge and survived. Soda, the contractor, slapped his knee. "That's not a bug. Lieutenant," he yelled, stepping closer to be heard. "That's feature number 4. Automatic liability reduction. You pay extra for that. If the logs don't exist, the investigation can't start. It's the most efficient part of the software." Rourke didn't laugh out loud. He just grinned, a predator, showing teeth, and took a drag from his cigarillo. "You boys are missing the point," he shouted, his voice cutting through the wind with practiced authority. "The system isn't designed to work. It's designed to be auditable. As long as the paperwork says the bird can fly, gravity is just a suggestion. You can crash $100 million into the ocean, gentlemen, and it's a tragedy. But if you lose the receipt for the fuel that put it there, that's a felony. That's the only sin this base recognizes." The laughter that followed was different. It was darker, acknowledging the absurdity of the moral architecture they lived in. They weren't laughing because it was funny. They were laughing because it was true. They were celebrating the hypocrisy that kept them employed. It was a specific kind of humor, the relief of the guilty who know the judge is on their payroll. They were mocking the very rules I worshipped, turning the strict lines of procedure into a punchline about survival. I stood 10 feet away, holding my own coffee cup like a weapon, not drinking. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just watched. I was the anthropologist of their corruption, cataloging the social signals of the cover-up. I watched Pike. He laughed too fast. He was the junior man, the one who had actually told the lie in the room, and his laughter was desperate. It was a plea for validation. I did good, right? I'm part of the tribe, right? He needed Rourke to bless the sin. I watched Sutter. He didn't laugh with his eyes. He laughed with his mouth. A wide, practiced rictus. He was calculating the billable hours of this conversation. To him, the lie wasn't a risk. It was a service deliverable. He was laughing because laughter was part of the contract, a necessary social lubricant to ensure the renewal option was exercised. And I watched Rourke. He didn't look at Pike or Sutter. He looked at the jet on the runway. His amusement was quiet. I settled. He wasn't laughing at the joke. He was laughing at the system itself. He knew that the noise, the blast, the power, it all belonged to him as long as he kept the paperwork clean. He was the only one who wasn't afraid. They didn't see me, or if they did, they didn't care. I was just the auditor. The furniture. My silence was interpreted as submission, not recording. I filed every laugh, every nod, every slap on the back into the ledger in my head. They were binding themselves together with this laughter, creating a complicity pact that was stronger than any non-disclosure agreement. If one went down now, they all went down, and they knew it. That's why they were so loud. They were drowning out the doubt. The engine test cycle ended abruptly. The roar cut out, leaving a sudden, ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. The vibration in the ground stopped. The dust settled. The laughter died with the engine, leaving them standing there in the sudden quiet, looking exposed. Rourke flicked his cigarillo butt onto the concrete and crushed it with the heel of his boot. The humor vanished from his face, replaced instantly by the mask of command. He checked his watch. "All right, Funzawa," he said, his voice sounding shockingly normal in the silence. "We have a window." "Sura, I want that firmware patch installed before the next patrol cycle, but don't log the start time until 1300. We need the gap to look like a standard reboot interval." "Understood," Sutter said, straightening his tie. "I'll backdate the work order." "Do it," Rourke said. "We'll handle the actual payload integration next week, after the inspection team clears out. We can't afford another glitch while they're watching the feed." "End fort, next week." The words hung in the dead air, more dangerous than the jet blast. They weren't fixing the problem. They were deferring it. They were pushing the risk down the timeline, betting that the invisible clock wouldn't run out before the inspectors left. I felt the pager on my hip. It was still silent, but the silence felt different now. It felt like a held breath. Rourke turned and saw me then. For a second, his eyes narrowed, assessing how much I'd heard, how much I understood. Then he dismissed me with a nod, turning his back to walk toward the ops door. He thought he had bought time. He thought the laughter had sealed the deal. He didn't realize that by pushing the integration to next week, he had just compressed the timeline of the catastrophe. He had just removed the safety margin. The clock wasn't slowing down. It was speeding up. The walk back from the flight line felt different. The adrenaline from the jet blast faded into a cold, prickly sweat. The hallway air was recycled and sterile, a sharp contrast to the kerosene heat outside, but it felt heavier. I checked my watch. 11:42. Rourke's next week deferral was a lie. By pushing the payload integration to a phantom window, he hadn't bought safety. He had removed the system's only buffer. The invisible clock wasn't just ticking anymore. It was sprinting. I felt the base's tempo accelerating, boots hitting the floor faster, phones ringing with a sharper edge. I reached the cage. My chair creaked. Usually a sound of safety. Today, a trap snapping shut. Bennett was gone. His terminal dark. But Navarro was there, standing by the printer, collating leaf forms. He didn't look up. That was the first signal. Usually, he'd offer a grimace about the coffee, something human. Today, he was purely procedural. I woke my screen. The prompt blinked, indifferent and green. I typed my sequence, muscle memory taking over, access granted. I navigated straight to the incident ticket queue, the digital graveyard where Rourke expected the anomaly buried. That's when I saw it. Small. A single line in the CC field of the closed ticket. Added, Operations Director Read Only. I froze. I hadn't added that list. Rourke wouldn't have. He wanted the ticket dead. Someone else had entered the closed record, modified visibility, and silently exited. A micro-betrayal, polite and devastating. By adding the operations director to the read-only list, but the maintenance patch lie was now visible to the highest authority, without flagging an alert. It spread the contagion. When the system inevitably crashed, the blast radius would include everyone. I looked at Navarro. He was still collating, the rhythmic thwop slide the only sound. He turned, catching my stare, his face a mask of duty. Paperwork never ends. Merced, he said softly. It wasn't an apology. It was a confirmation. He had done it. Navarro, the witness who knew the routers were air-gapped. He hadn't stood up to Rourke or joined the laughter. He had just quietly ensured I wasn't the only one holding the grenade. Defensible. Just ensuring visibility. But in this building, visibility was a weapon. The timestamp was 11:30. 12 minutes ago, while I stood in the jet blast, the compulsion hit me. Nausea and clarity. I couldn't just watch. The system was rotting, corruption spreading through polite edits. If I waited, I would be buried with them. I opened my drawer and pulled out Form DD 2894, Incident Escalation and Whistleblower Protection Request. I didn't fill it out. You don't, until you're ready to burn your life down. I placed it on the desk, invisible. Then I opened the command line. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to trigger the escalation ladder. It's not just telling your boss's boss. In practice, the escalation ladder is a mechanical sequence, a series of digital tumblers that cannot be unturned. I typed the code to flag the ticket. Disputed. Integrity check required. A yellow warning popped up. Action will freeze asset. Confirm. I hesitated. Fingerhorn. This was where the private rule of evidence discipline collided with the public mask. Pressing this declared war on Rourke, Bike, Sutter, and Navarro. I looked at him. He was watching. Papers forgotten. He knew what the yellow box meant. He knew. I knew. Don't, he whispered. I pressed enter. The screen flashed red, then locked gray. Escalation logged. Acid frozen. The silence shattered with the violent realization that the safety was off. My phone rang instantly. Klein, base security. The ladder worked fast. Merced. Klein's voice was clipped. I have a flag on a closed incident. You locked a flight line asset during a patrol cycle. Tell me this is a keystroke error. Not an error. Sir? My voice was steady, though my hand trembled. It's a dispute. Maintenance log doesn't match physical gate roster. I'm initiating a chain of custody audit. Mercer. Listen. Klein's tone dropped. You are bypassing command. You are bypassing ops. If you hold this line, I have to open a formal inquiry. Do you understand the timeline you're triggering? I understand. I said, the escalation ladder requires it. Alum. Heavy silence followed. I heard Klein calculating the risk. He wasn't one of them, but not my friend. He was a creature of the perimeter, and I had just breached it from the inside. Hold position, Klein said finally. I'm sending a team to secure the terminal. Do not touch anything else. The line went dead. Navarro put the papers down, looking at me with pity and fear. I had done the right thing. I had followed the sequence. But looking at the gray screen, I realized the escalation hadn't gone where I thought. Klein wasn't investigating the routers. He was securing my terminal. I hadn't just flagged the error. I had flagged myself as the risk. The ladder went both ways, and I was on the wrong rung. Security didn't storm the cage. There were no shouts, no weapons drawn, no aggressive posturing. That would have been honest. Instead, 2 Master-at-Arms personnel simply appeared at the perimeter of the bullpen, standing with their hands clasped behind their backs, watching the aisle. They weren't there to arrest me. They were there to curate the environment. They were a physical bracket placed around my desk, turning my workspace into a quarantine zone. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting on my knees under the desk. The gray asset-frozen screen cast a dull, lifeless pallor over my cubicle. The office around me had engaged in a collective act of erasure. Bennett typed furiously, his headset on, pretending the silence wasn't thick enough to choke on. Navarro was gone, vanished into the stacks the moment Klein picked up the phone. I was an unexploded ordnance sitting in the middle of logistics, and everyone was walking carefully around the blast radius. I felt a cold clarity settle in the base of my spine. The paranoia wasn't a buzzing anxiety anymore. It was a lens. It sharpened the edges of the room. I watched the Master-at-Arms on the left. He checked his watch every 30 seconds. He wasn't watching me for a threat response. He was watching the time. He was worried about his lunch break, or his shift change. Even the jailers were operating on a schedule that had nothing to do with justice. The door to the main corridor opened. It wasn't Klein. It was Commander Rourke. He didn't stomp. He walked with a terrifying, efficient purpose, cutting a straight line through the maze of cubicles. He didn't look at the staff. He didn't look at the security detail. He walked straight to my desk and stopped, his belt buckle at my eye level. He smelled of breath, mints, and burnt coffee. "Unlock it," he said. His voice was low, stripped of the performative command he used in briefings. This was raw friction. He was looking at the gray screen, not at me. His pupils were dilated, focused entirely on the digital obstacle blocking his patrol cycle. "I can't. Commandé," I said, keeping my voice flat. "The escalation ladder locks the user out once the dispute is filed. Only the Inspector General can clear the flag. Now." Rourke finally looked down at me. His eyes were hard, glassy. I recognized the look immediately. I'd seen it in pilots during simulator runs when they locked onto a bogey and flew straight into the ground. Target fixation. He wasn't seeing the corruption. He wasn't seeing the mismatched logs or the potential sabotage I had flagged. He was seeing a red light on his dashboard that needed to turn green. He was fixated on the symptom, the frozen asset, and he was blind to the system underneath it. To him, I wasn't a whistleblower. I was a malfunction. I was a stuck valve in a pipeline that needed to flow. "You think this protects you?" Rourke asked. He leaned in, placing one hand on the partition wall. The cheap fabric compressed under his fingers. "You think filing a dispute creates a shield? It just creates a target." I didn't blink. I didn't recoil. This was the turn. For months, I had thought Rourke was the architect of the corruption. Now, looking at the sheer, narrow obsession in his face, I realized I was wrong. He wasn't the architect. He was just the mechanic trying to keep the machine running at redline. He didn't care why the logs were faked, only that they allowed him to fly. That made him more dangerous than a villain. A villain has a plan. A man with target fixation just has a trajectory, and he will crush anything in his path to maintain it. "I'm not trying to be protected, Sir," I said. "I'm trying to be accurate." He stared at me for a long second, processing the refusal. He realized then that intimidation wouldn't clear the flag. The software didn't care about his rank. He needed a workaround. He pushed himself off the wall, the fixation shifting from me to the immediate tactical problem. "Fine," he said. He straightened his uniform, the mask of command sliding back into place. "If we can't clear the asset, we isolate the node. We assume the terminal is compromised." He turned to the security detail. "Secure this workstation. Nobody touches it. Nobody logs in." He looked back at me, his gaze sweeping over me like I was a piece of surplus equipment to be mothballed. "And secure the area? I don't want this contagion spreading to the ops floor." He pulled his radio from his belt. He didn't switch channels. He transmitted on the open command frequency, his voice calm, decisive, and loud enough for the entire bullpen to hear. "Command, this is Rourke. Initiate partial lockdown on the admin block. We have a localized integrity breach in logistics. Restrict movement to essential personnel only. Seal the exits." The term hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Partial lockdown. It sounded like a safety protocol. It sounded like he was protecting the base. But as the magnetic locks on the main doors thudded home with a heavy, metallic clack, I knew what it really was. He wasn't locking the threat out. He was locking the narrative in. The invisible clock had stopped ticking and started suffocating. The magnetic locks on the main double doors engaged with a heavy, the final thud that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a slam. It was a mechanical certainty. The sound changed the air pressure in the bullpen instantly. The low hum of the HVAC system seemed to deepen, recycling the same stale molecules of anxiety. The open windows of the admin block, usually a source of distant flight line noise, were now sealed behind blast shutters that had rolled down automatically. The view of the runway was gone, replaced by perforated steel slats. We were contained. I sat at my frozen terminal, my hands still resting on my knees. The asset frozen message had timed out, replaced by a generic blue screen. "Le système maintenance. Do not power off." It was polite. It was clean. It was a lie designed to keep the panic level manageable. Around me, the office had stopped pretending to work. Phones were being cradled. Heads were turning toward the exits. The whispers started low, a murmur of confusion that hadn't yet ripened into fear. Attention. The PA system crackled. It wasn't the usual voice of the quarterdeck watch. It was a recorded announcement, smooth and devoid of human inflection. Base status update. Command has initiated a partial lockdown for Sector 4. Incident response teams are securing the perimeter. Remain at your stations. Limit movement to essential tasks only. This is a precautionary measure. Precautionary? The word hung in the air, antiseptic and heavy. A young yeoman near the water cooler pulled out his personal cell phone. He held it low, below the partition wall, his thumb swiping rapidly. I saw the screen glow reflect in his glasses. He wasn't checking news. He was recording. He was live streaming the lockdown. The recording culture of the base didn't stop for emergencies. It fed on them. He wanted to be the first source, the leak that broke the dam. Put that away, I said. My voice was quiet, barely carrying over the partition. He looked at me, startled. What? I'm just telling my wife I'm okay. You're broadcasting a security posture during an active incident? I said. If they see that signal leaving the building before the official clear, they won't just confiscate your phone. They'll pull your clearance. He hesitated. Defiance, warring with the sudden realization that I wasn't speaking as a colleague. I was speaking as the system. He slid the phone into his pocket. He didn't thank me. He looked at me with a new kind of wariness. I wasn't just the woman who froze the assets. I was the woman who knew the rules of the cage too well. The door to the inner corridor opened, the only one not magnetically sealed. 2 MPs walked in. They weren't the Master-at-Arms detail from earlier. These were full kit. Helmets, vests, zip ties on their belts. They moved with the heavy, muffled tread of men carrying weight. They didn't look at the yeoman. They didn't look at Bennett. They walked straight to the center of the room and stopped. D checks? The lead MP said. His voice was muffled by the chin strap. Have your CAC cards on the desk? Visible. It was a standard procedure. A head count. But the timing was wrong. You don't do ID checks 5 minutes after sealing the doors unless you're looking for someone specific who shouldn't be there, or making sure someone specific doesn't leave. I placed my common access card on the gray laminate of my desk. The chip faced up. The hologram of the eagle caught the fluorescent light, flickering like a dying bird. The MP moved down the row, checking cards against a tablet. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic. It was the metronome of the invisible clock. He reached my desk. He didn't scan my card immediately. He looked at the tablet, then at my face, then at the card. He tapped the screen. Mercer. Danael, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Restricted movement status? He said, reading from the screen. You are flagged for an interview with the Inspector General's liaison. You are to remain at this workstation until collected. Collected. I repeated. Not escorted. Not summoned. Collected. Like evidence? Do not leave this cubicle, he said. He scanned the card finally. The beep was lower. A discordant tone. Access limited. He moved on to the next desk. I sat there, the blue screen of my terminal glowing in my peripheral vision. The trap I had built for Rourke was working, but it had pivoted. The escalation ladder had triggered a containment response, but Rourke had used his command authority to frame the containment around me. He hadn't broken the rules. He had used the rules of incident response to freeze the accuser while he scrubbed the logs. He was cleaning the crime scene while I was legally prohibited from looking at it. Bennett leaned over the partition. His face was pale. "Merced," he whispered. "What did you do?" "I filed a form," I said. "They don't send a tactical team for a form." "They do, if the form threatens the flight schedule," I said. I looked down at my belt. The pager. It was still silent. The black plastic felt warm, radiating a dull heat against my hip. I needed it to ping. I needed the external escalation, the dead man's switch that bypassed the base hierarchy, to kick in. If it stayed silent, it meant the signal was blocked. It meant the lockdown wasn't just physical, it was electronic. Then, I felt it. Not a sound, a vibration, a single, short pulse against my hip bone. Then another. Bing. I looked down. The tiny LCD screen on the pager wasn't blank anymore. It displayed a single string of numbers. Not a phone number. A timestamp. 09-1403. The exact second of the link degrade. Someone outside the cage had seen the signal. Someone outside the partial lockdown had found the anomaly I flagged before my access was cut. The clock hadn't stopped. It had just synchronized. Rourke thought he had me contained in a box of silence. He didn't know I had just received a signal from the outside world. And that signal meant the war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The silence in the cubicle wasn't empty. It was pressurized. The partial lockdown had turned the admin block into a vacuum chamber. The server hum, a mechanical heartbeat counting down to an invisible impact. My pager felt heavy against my hip, the 09-1403 timestamp burning into my skin. Proof the system hadn't failed. It had been steered. Around me, containment shifted from physical to procedural. MPs weren't just standing guard. They were curating history. One moved to the printer station, removed the paper tray, and sealed it in an evidence bag. No words. No eye contact. He moved to the shredder bin and sealed that too. Stérile. Efficient erasure. They weren't looking for a threat. They were ensuring no new version of the truth could be printed. Bennett stared at his dark screen, palms flat on the desk. He wasn't working. He was waiting to be told what he had seen. Stage 1 of the pattern. Induced amnesia. The lockdown wasn't about keeping people in. It was about keeping the narrative from leaking until scrubbed clean. "Officer," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the dead air. The MP, near my desk, turned, face a blank visor of indifference. No talking. "Ma'am, I need to use the restroom." A small, biological boundary pushed against the procedural wall. "Escort required?" "Wait for the female liaison." "How long?" "Until the incident commander clears the movement log." There it was. Not hostility, but administration. Accu. They were using time as a weapon, delaying basic needs to reinforce hierarchy. I wasn't a prisoner. I was a ticket in a backlog. The invisible clock wasn't counting down to a bomb, but to my obsolescence. He sat back, the compulsion to sort and fix aching behind my eyes. I closed them, letting the darkness sharpen the map. The link degrade at 0914. The ghost login 3 seconds prior. The maintenance patch explanation. The escalation ladder I had climbed, only to find Rourke waiting at the top with a lockdown order. It wasn't Rourke. The realization hit with the cold clarity of a spreadsheet balancing. Rourke was a pilot. He thought in vectors and fuel loads. He didn't know how to retroactively modify a permission list without tripping a checksum or synchronize a remote update with a satellite handover. Rourke was the muscle, shouting about target fixation, the pattern, the seamless integration of technical failure and administrative cover-up. That was procurement. That was the contractor, Graham Sutter. I opened my eyes. The pieces clicked into a terrifying shape. Sutter had access to the legacy routers because he sold them. He had access to maintenance logs because he wrote the software. And he had access to Rourke because Rourke needed birds to fly to make rank. A symbiosis of ambition and greed, lubricated by the paperwork I was supposed to audit. The audit trap hadn't caught a glitch. It had caught a business model. And I was the foreign object in the gears. The corridor door opened. Not an MP this time. Captain Hart, the base commander, walked in with lethal gravity. Rourke trailed him, looking smaller, less certain. Behind them, a civilian suit I recognized. JAG Corps lawyer. They walked past me toward the server room. But as they passed, the lawyer dropped a single sheet of paper on my desk. He didn't break stride. I looked down. Amemu. Subject. Personnel reassignment. Immediate. Not an arrest warrant. Not a firing squad. A transfer order. Logistics. Support unit. Diego Garcia. A rock in the middle of the Indian Ocean. A career graveyard where auditors went to count coconuts until they quit. I touched the paper. Still warm from the printer. Likely the secure command suites. The only one unsealed. Mercer, Rourke said, stopping at the server room door. He didn't look triumphant, just tired. Pack your personal effects. You're clearing out. I stood up. My knees were steady. The partial lockdown was lifting. Magnetic locks disengaged with a soft clack. Air pressure normalized. The system had protected itself. They were cutting out the cancer. May, to save the host. The logs? I said. The timestamp on the link degrade. It doesn't match the patch window. The investigation is closed, Hart said, his voice final as a stone dropping into a well. The contractor identified the anomaly as a sensor calibration error. It's been patched, buried. I looked at the transfer order. This was the cost. The price of being right in a room that needed you to be wrong. I could scream, wave the pager, demand review, but the evidence was gone. The tray sealed, server logs scrubbed before I reached the door. I picked up the memo, folding it neatly, aligning edges with lifetime precision. I placed it in my pocket, next to the pager. The craving for order remained, but the objective had changed. I didn't need to fix the base anymore. I needed to survive the exit. Navarro had reappeared at his desk, head down, shuffling papers. He couldn't look at me. He was part of the survival mechanism now. I grabbed my bag. Ignoring the lying blue terminal screen, I walked toward the door, passing Rourke and Hart. No salute. No not. Just walking. The audit trap had worked perfectly. It revealed the truth. But truth, I realized stepping into the harsh hallway light, had no currency here. Only paperwork did. And mine said I was gone. The invisible clock had run out. The explosion had happened, and I was the only casualty. The base didn't mourn. It just rebooted. I stood at the edge of the flight line, holding a cardboard box that contained the last 3 years of my life. The sun was exactly where it had been yesterday, a white hot disk hammering the tarmac. The heat shimmer distorted the horizon, turning the distant hangars into liquid mirages. Behind me, the admin block was already humming with the rhythm of the afternoon shift. The blast shutters had rolled up. The windows were open again. The partial lockdown was a memory, erased from the air as efficiently as the logs had been scrubbed from the server. A jet roared down the runway, its afterburners cutting 2 orange gashes in the air. It lifted off, clean and heavy, carrying a payload that was officially verified, maintained, and logged. The noise was deafening, a physical vibration that rattled the pens in my box. It was the sound of the system working. It was the sound of a machine that had successfully expelled a foreign object and returned to optimal parameters. Nobody looked at me. The ground crew in their yellow vests were focused on the next bird. The MPs at the gate were checking IDs with board efficiency. I was already a ghost. My access was revoked. My badge deactivated. My name removed from the active roster. I wasn't Mercer from Audit anymore. I was just a civilian in a skirt standing in a restricted area, waiting for a transport that would take me to the terminal, and then to a rock in the middle of the ocean. I looked down at the box. Achetable. Amer. A framed certificate of appreciation from 2 years ago. And at the bottom, Hielen under Sparkardigan. The pager. It was silent. The screen was blank. The timestamp 091403 had faded, replaced by the default standby cursor. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was just plastic and silicon. The audit trap had sprung. The evidence had been captured, and the truth had been known. But truth, I realized, has a half-life. It decays rapidly when exposed to the atmosphere of necessity. A gray sedan pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a taxi. It was a base shuttle, driven by a young seaman who looked like he hadn't started shaving yet. He got out and opened the trunk. He didn't offer to take the box. "Ma'am," he said. "Transport to the rotator flight?" "Yes." "Need to see your transfer orders?" I pulled the memo from my pocket. It was creased now, the edges soft. I handed it to him. He glanced at it, checking the signature block, then handed it back. He didn't care why I was leaving. He didn't know about the legacy routers or the ghost logins or the man who had looked at me with target fixation in his eyes. He just saw a piece of paper that authorized a movement. "Clear," he said. "Hop in." I sat in the back seat. The air conditioning was cold, smelling of pine air freshener. The car pulled away, moving smoothly through the base traffic. We passed the operations center. We passed the blast deflection wall where Rourke and Sutter had laughed. We passed the server node. Everything looked exactly the same. The grass was cut. The lines were painted. The flags snapped in the wind. It was terrifyingly stable. The cost of that stability was sitting in the back seat of a government sedan, holding a box of office supplies. Rourke would make admiral. Sutter would renew his contract. The software would get a patch that fixed the symptom but hid the disease. And I would go to Diego Garcia and count fuel drums until my pension vested or I quit. I felt a tightness in my chest, a phantom echo of the compulsion that had driven me here. I wanted to tell the driver to stop. I wanted to run back into the building and scream that they were flying on borrowed time. But the tightness faded, replaced by a dull, heavy fatigue. It was over. The escalation ladder had run out of rungs. I opened the box and took out the pager. I held it in my hand for a long moment. It was the only thing I had left that proved any of this had happened. It was the only witness. We reached the main gate. The driver slowed down, waiting for the barrier to lift. Beyond the fence, the civilian world waited. Messu, chaotic, unaudited. I rolled down the window. The heat rushed in, thick and humid. "Ma'am," the driver asked, looking in the rearview mirror. "You okay back there?" "I'm fine," I said. I tossed the pager into the trash can next to the guard shack. It hit the metal liner with a hollow clunk. The barrier lifted. The car accelerated. I didn't look back. I didn't watch the base recede in the mirror. I just watched the road ahead, a ribbon of asphalt stretching into the heat. The system had won, but as I closed my eyes and listened to the tires humming on the pavement, I knew one thing. It had won because I let it. I had traded my career for the certainty that somewhere, deep in a backup tape that Rourke couldn't erase, there was a record of 09-1403. It wouldn't save me. It wouldn't fire them. But it was there. A single, immutable fact in a world of malleable paperwork. And that, I decided, as the silence settled over me like a heavy blanket, would have to be enough